Joining us now is the Maryland congressman and member of the January 6th committee, Jamie Raskin. He's a congressman from Maryland. Congressman, good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Great to be with you, Ali.
Congressman, what do you make of all of the posturing by Donald Trump about immunity? He makes sort of two separate cases. One is that he's immune from anything he did while he was president, which would tackle a couple of the cases he's involved in. It wouldn't deal with everything. But the other is that with respect to the election, he was tried by Congress and he was not convicted by the Senate. You'll recall after Donald Trump's acquittal by the Senate, Mitch McConnell himself said this is a matter for the courts to handle. Apparently not for Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, on the first point, immunity from prosecution for crimes committed during the course of your presidency would be a standing invitation to do what Donald Trump did to try to overthrow the government, because you could never be prosecuted for trying to do that. So Trump would be setting the template for people getting into office and then doing whatever they could, lie, cheat, and steal in order to convert our constitutional democracy into a dictatorship. So it's ridiculous, and it's directly contradicted by the language of the Constitution, which says that the president can be prosecuted later. Even if he's impeached for office, he is still subject to prosecution and trial and punishment, Article 1, Section 3, Clause 7. But even beyond that stuff, in terms of, what you're raising there, they're running around saying, well, he should be able to take office again despite Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Why? Because it would be undemocratic to exclude him from the ballot. But of course, that was a decision made when the Constitution was amended in 1868. That's an argument that's more than a century too late. If they want to amend the Constitution now, they should go ahead and change the Constitution. They need a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate and 3/4 of the states. But in any event, I would say, there are different ways that people are disqualified for running for president. There's 75 million people, Americans, who can't run because of age restrictions. You've got to be 35 years old, okay? There are 25 million people who can't run because they're American citizens, but they were born abroad. These are kind of morally arbitrary distinctions, but they keep at least 100 million people from being eligible for president in this election. Donald Trump is in a class of maybe a dozen people who essentially have disqualified themselves under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment because they engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the democracy. So I would say that this is a pro-democratic provision that fortifies and strengthens democracy.
And this is what a number of the proponents of that argument say, that this is actually meant to protect democracy. One of the arguments that Donald Trump supporters in this make is that it hasn't been determined. It hasn't been determined legally that he was involved in an insurrection. I would argue that the Colorado Supreme Court really looked into this. They really studied all the ways you could interpret a rebellion and all the things that Donald Trump did, much of which you saw as a member of the January 6th committee. We all saw. They said that's not the part that's in question, really.
Well, it was a painstaking factual analysis that the Colorado court engaged in, and they also defined an insurrection, according to original sources, as something more than a riot, but less than a full-blown revolution. An insurrection is a riot, essentially, that has a political purpose. And of course, that riot had a very specific political purpose, which was to block the peaceful transfer of power under the Constitution and to get Donald Trump in. I mean, imagine if Vice President Pence had said, you know what, you guys win. I'm buckling under, and I'm going to simply declare that Donald Trump has won. I'm going to reject electoral college votes from Arizona, from Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Does anybody in his or her right mind think that Donald Trump would have said, no, I was just kidding. The way you really do this under the 12th Amendment, under the Constitution, is you count all the electoral college votes. And, I was just kidding about all that stuff. Of course not. He would have taken the office. He would have proceeded to impose martial law, as Michael Flynn had been urging him to do. And we would be living under a completely different form of government right now. So if we listen to the wisdom of the founders, if we follow the literal text of the Constitution, Donald Trump simply can't be president again. There are tens of millions of other people in the country who can be, but he has disqualified himself under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment by trying to overthrow the constitutional order.
What do you make of the discussion that's been getting a lot of ink these days by people who are not constitutional experts about whether it would be more satisfying or less satisfying to have Donald Trump disqualified versus defeated at the polls?
I mean, it's an irrelevant question, legally speaking. I mean, at this point, we should be focused on who is qualified to run and who's not qualified to run. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is not some kind of aberrational, eccentric provision in the Constitution. I count more than a half dozen different provisions in the Constitution that specifically target insurrectionary activity. So, like, take Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, which says Congress has the power to call forth the militias from the states in order to suppress insurrections. You look at the Republican Guarantee Clause in Article 4, which says Congress shall guarantee to the people of the states a Republican form of government and assist them in putting down domestic violence. You look at the Treason Clause, the only place where a crime is defined in the Constitution. It consists of levying arms against the Union or adhering to the enemies thereof. So, even Jefferson Davis, it's so interesting that some people are now claiming, well, Section 3 doesn't apply to the 14th Amendment. Jefferson Davis, when he was tried for treason in Virginia, claimed erroneously and unsuccessfully that he could not be tried for treason because he already was guilty under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment and therefore was being punished by not being able to serve as president. Of course, it's not double jeopardy because it's not even a criminal punishment under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. It's just stating a qualification or a disqualification for serving in federal or state office after you've engaged in insurrection or rebellion.
What's your sense of how this plays out? Donald Trump has appealed everything, as is his legal right to do, that he has the ability to appeal. The D.C. Court of Appeals is quite central these days. We're going to be hearing from them a couple of times. At some point, we are probably going to miss the dates by which this federal trial needs to start at the beginning of March. Is it your sense that this will go to trial before the election?
Yes, I believe that the Jack Smith case will proceed on the various insurrection charges and the conspiracy to interfere and obstruct a federal proceeding and obstruction of a federal proceeding and denial of the voting rights of the people and defrauding the public. I think that those charges will be heard and that trial will go forward. It really has to go forward. Otherwise it's going to create, even greater problems down the road. But I think also this Section 3 of the 14th Amendment question has got to be settled by the Supreme Court. I mean, this is the test of textualism and originalism on the Supreme Court. Do the self-defined textualists and originalists really believe their own rhetoric? Because the language is completely straightforward and the purposes are clear. I mean, when the radical Republicans who put this in the Constitution started, it was far broader. It was total disenfranchisement forever of anybody who participated in rebellion or secession or insurrection. When it got over the Senate, they said that's way too broad. Let's narrow it in to the class of people who were office holders before, who violated their oath of office by engaging in it. And then even then, we're not going to disenfranchise them. Somebody like Donald Trump can continue voting, but they cannot serve in office again because they've proven themselves untrustworthy.
Yeah, it's akin to you can't ride on this ride at the amusement park if you're not this tall. It's disqualification. It's not even a penalty. It's just you're not qualified to be on the ballot.
That's right. And as I was saying, there's tens of millions of people who are not qualified to run for president either. And some of them might be perfectly qualified. I've got colleagues on the Democratic side, the Republican side, who are not 35 years old. Maxwell Frost would be a great president. AOC is not 35. There's others who can serve, but okay, that's just the Constitution. It's not undemocratic. It's the rules of the game. And these are our rules under the Constitution. The question is whether the court is going to act like a real court.
To have somebody who understands the Constitution as much as you do to even be president. Jamie Raskin, always good to see you. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.